Everyone in Millbrook had a story about the silent girl. They said she was simple, touched in the head, a ghost who haunted the floors of Henderson's general store with a broom in her hand and a permanent shadow in her eyes. For 2 years, Sarah Mae Thompson had been a fixture in the dusty Arizona town, and in all that time, nobody had ever heard her laugh. Nobody had ever seen her smile. She was just there. A quiet, unassuming part of the scenery, like the red mesas that loomed on the horizon or the tumbleweeds that rolled down Main Street. The townfolk whispered, "Of course. They were good at that." "Came from back east," Mrs. Abernathy would say over a bolt of calico. "Some awful tragedy. The war, I hear." "Poor thing," Mrs. Caldwell would reply, her voice a low hum of pity. "Probably ain't right in the head. Best to just leave her be." And they did. They left her be. They ignored her, talked around her, treated her like a piece of furniture that just happened to sweep the floors and stack the canned peaches. Sarah Mae heard it all. She felt their pity, their suspicion, their casual cruelty. But she never said a word. She kept her head down, her dark hair pulled into a tight, practical braid, and her hands busy. Let them whisper. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was a hornet's nest, and she had no intention of ever stirring it up again. The truth had burned down her old life, and she'd come to Millbrook to bury the ashes. She wanted peace. She wanted silence. But on a scorching July afternoon in 1876, when the sun beat down on the cracked earth like a blacksmith's hammer, peace was the last thing on the menu. Death was coming to Millbrook. It rode in on a lathered horse, with spurs that jangled like a death rattle and a Colt .45 that gleamed like a hungry promise in the desert glare. The day had started like any other. The oppressive heat, the drone of flies, the scent of dust and horse manure. Sarah was arranging a new shipment of tinware, her calloused fingers moving with an efficiency that went unnoticed. The whispers of Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs. Caldwell were a familiar background noise, no more bothersome than the creak of the floorboards. Then, at precisely noon, the world tilted on its axis. The brass bell over the store's entrance didn't just chime, it screamed. Sheriff Thomas Wyatt stumbled in, his face pale, his hand already clamped on the butt of his pistol. He was a good man, or so everyone thought. Fair, honest, with kind eyes that seemed out of place in his weathered face. "Sarah Mae," he said, his voice tight. "Get to the back, lock the door, don't come out." He didn't need to say more. The thunder of galloping horses was closing in fast, a drumbeat of doom that shook the very windows of the store. It was followed by a ragged volley of gunshots and the splintering crash of wood. Screams erupted from the street, pure, unadulterated panic. The townfolk scattered like quail, diving behind water troughs, scrambling into alleyways, their faces masks of terror. Sheriff Wyatt ran back outside, pulling the door shut behind him. But Sarah Mae wasn't moving toward the back room to hide. Her blood, which had felt like slush in her veins just a moment ago, was now fire. The familiar, terrible fire she thought she had extinguished forever. Her movements were fluid, economical. She didn't run. She glided. Past the sacks of flour, past the barrels of pickles, to the small, cluttered storeroom at the rear of the building. Mr. Henderson kept his hunting rifles there, hung on a dusty rack behind a stack of horse blankets. Her fingers, which the townsfolk thought were only good for dusting shelves, closed around the cool, smooth wood of a Winchester lever-action rifle. There was no trembling, no hesitation. It felt like an old friend. A terrible, long-lost friend. Outside, a voice boomed across the town square, a gravelly roar that seemed to claw at the air. "Thomas Wyatt!" Sarah peered through a grimy crack in the back wall. She saw him, a mountain of a man on a black stallion, his face a road map of scars and hard living under a wild mane of dark hair. Jake Morrison. A name whispered in fearful tones across 3 territories, a cold-blooded killer, a recent escapee from Yuma Territorial Prison, and he hadn't come alone. 4 other riders fanned out behind him, a quartet of vultures, their rifles held with casual menace. "I'm here for you, Wyatt," Morrison bellowed, his voice echoing off the adobe walls. "You took my brother from me. Now I'm going to take your whole damn town apart, piece by piece, until you come out and pay the piper." Through the front window, Sarah could see the sheriff standing alone in the middle of Main Street, a solitary pillar of law in a whirlwind of chaos. He looked calm, but Sarah saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on his holster. He was a brave man, and he was about to die, 5 against 1. The math was simple, it was brutal, it was final. "Your brother drew on me, Jake." Wyatt's voice was steady, carrying across the unnatural silence that had fallen over the town. "He was robbing the bank. He made his choice." Morrison's laugh was a horrifying sound, like grinding rock. "Mistake? The only mistake was my brother not putting you in the ground. But don't you worry. I'm here to fix that for him." Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun. Time slowed to a crawl. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeams seemed to freeze in place. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner demanding release. She'd seen this before. A different town, a different lifetime, a good man standing against impossible odds, and she had hidden. She had cowered in the shadows while the world burned around her. She had let fear swallow her whole. Not again. Never again. The front door of Henderson's general store opened with a soft, deliberate creak, and Sarah Mae Thompson, the silent girl, the simple-minded store clerk, stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun. She held the Winchester loosely in her hands, the barrel pointed toward the ground. It wasn't a threat. Not yet. It was a statement. Her footsteps were utterly silent on the wooden boardwalk as she moved past the sheriff, placing herself directly in the path of the 5 riders. The entire town held its breath. Jaws hung slack. Eyes bulged. The quiet girl who flinched when someone spoke her name was now standing between a notorious outlaw and the town's only lawman. And she didn't look scared. She looked bored. For the first time in 2 years, her voice rang out, not a whisper, but a clear, commanding tone that cut through the tension like a razor. "That's enough, Jake Morrison." Every head swiveled. Every eye was fixed on her. Sheriff Wyatt looked as stunned as anyone else. Jake Morrison's horse sidled nervously, sensing the shift in the air. He squinted down at the slip of a girl who had appeared as if from thin air. "Well, well," he sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "What do we have here? Did the little church mouse lose its way?" His men chuckled, their confidence returning. Sarah didn't even glance at them. Her gaze was locked on Morrison, and it was as cold and flat as a frozen lake. "I said," she repeated, her voice dropping an octave, carrying an authority that made 2 of Morrison's men stop laughing and shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "That's enough." Morrison's smile faltered. There was something in her eyes, something ancient and dangerous that didn't belong in the face of a store clerk. "And who in the hell might you be to tell me what to do, girl?" he growled. But the contempt in his voice was now laced with a thread of uncertainty. She took a single step forward, the dust swirling around the hem of her worn brown dress. "My name is Sarah Mae Thompson," she said calmly. "But you might know me by a different name, the one they gave me 2 years ago, in a little town called Cedar Ridge, Colorado." A flicker of confusion crossed Morrison's face. Cedar Ridge? The name meant nothing to him. Sarah's lips curved into a faint, chilling smile. "They called me the Angel of Cedar Ridge," she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. "But the men I put in the ground, they called me something else." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every eye in the square bore into her. "They called me ma'am before they died." The words hung in the scorching air. A collective gasp went through the hidden townsfolk. Sheriff Wyatt's eyes widened, a dawning horror and understanding on his face. He took a half step back, as if she were the real threat. Morrison just stared. "You're bluffing. You're no one." "Am I?" Sarah said. "Ask your man, Charlie, on your left. The one with the scar above his eye. Ask him where he got it." All eyes, including Morrison's, shot to the rider named Charlie. The man went white as a sheet, his hand trembling so hard he nearly dropped his rifle. He looked at Sarah as if he were seeing a ghost. "No," Charlie whispered, his voice cracking. "It can't be." "I remember you, Charlie," Sarah continued, her voice as soft as silk and as sharp as a shard of glass. "You were with the O'Donnell boys when they tried to hit that payroll train outside of Durango. You were the one who ran. I let you go. I told you if I ever saw you again, I'd finish the job." Charlie let out a choked cry and wheeled his horse around, spurring it into a frantic gallop out of town without a single look back. He fled as if the devil himself were on his heels. The other riders stared after him, then back at Sarah, their faces now painted with raw fear. Who are you?" one of them stammered. Sarah's gaze snapped back to Morrison. "I was a federal marshal for 6 years. I've hunted men worse than you across 3 territories. I've faced down killers who'd make you look like a choir boy on Sunday morning. And I've never, not once, backed down when scum like you threaten innocent people." Her story was a lie, a beautiful, terrible lie she had constructed piece by piece. But it was a lie she was willing to die for. Morrison's hand, which had been hovering over his Colt, was now frozen in place. He was a killer, yes, but he was also a creature of the outlaw world, a world built on legends and reputations. And the stories she was spinning, the cold certainty in her eyes, the sudden flight of his own man. It was starting to sound horrifyingly real. "You're lying," he snarled, but it was a question, not a statement. His conviction was bleeding out into the dust at his feet. "Am I?" Sarah raised the Winchester, the movement so smooth and fast it was a blur. The rifle wasn't aimed at his chest. It was aimed at the rope holding the sign for the Millbrook Saloon, a good 50 yards away. Crack. The rifle spit fire, the rope snapped, and the heavy wooden sign crashed to the ground, sending up a cloud of dust. It was a shot that a seasoned marksman would be proud of. From a slip of a girl holding a heavy rifle, it was impossible. Silence. A profound, ringing silence. Even the horses seemed to be holding their breath. "I'll make you a deal, Morrison," Sarah said, her voice deceptively gentle. "You and your boys turn your horses around and ride out of here. You don't look back. You don't stop until you're over that mesa. Do that, and you live to see the sunset." She took another step forward. "Stay," she whispered, "and I'll bury all of you right where you sit." One of the remaining riders, a young man with fear-widened eyes, threw his rifle into the dust. "I'm out, Jake. I ain't dying for this." He turned his horse and followed Charlie's path out of town. The third rider hesitated for only a second before doing the same. Now, it was just Morrison. Alone. His face was a storm of fury, humiliation, and a creeping, primal fear. He stared at Sarah, then at the sheriff, who was watching the scene unfold with a look of utter disbelief. "You think this is over?" Morrison spat, his voice shaking with rage. "It was over the moment I stepped outside," Sarah replied. For a long, agonizing moment, Morrison's hand twitched over his gun. The whole town, the whole world, seemed to hang on that single tense movement. It was the moment of truth. Then, with a guttural curse that ripped from his throat, he yanked on his horse's reins, wheeling the big stallion around so violently it reared up on its hind legs. "This ain't finished, Wyatt," he screamed over his shoulder, but his threat was aimed at the wrong person. He spurred his horse mercilessly, galloping away into the oppressive heat, a lone figure disappearing into the shimmering waves of air rising from the desert floor. He was gone. Sarah stood there, unmoving, the Winchester still held at the ready, until the dust cloud that was Jake Morrison had completely vanished. Only then did she allow the rifle to lower. Only then did she allow herself to take a breath. The silence was broken by a strange, shuffling sound. The people of Millbrook were emerging from their hiding places. They moved slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a mythical creature. Their faces were no longer filled with pity or suspicion. They were filled with awe and a healthy dose of fear. Sheriff Wyatt was the first to approach her. He stopped a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his expression a chaotic mix of gratitude and confusion. "Marshal Thompson?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Just Sarah May," she corrected quietly, her voice returning to its familiar softness. The fire was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "I left that life behind a long time ago." "Why?" the sheriff asked, his brow furrowed. "Why give up a career like that, a reputation like that, to sweep floors?" Sarah looked down at the Winchester in her hands, as if seeing it for the first time. The weight of it was more than just wood and steel. It was the weight of a life she had tried to escape, a past she had tried to bury. "Because I got tired of the noise," she whispered, so low he had to lean in to hear. "The gunshots, the screaming, the dying." Mrs. Abernathy, her face streaked with tears and dust, rushed forward and grabbed Sarah's arm. Her touch was surprisingly firm. "Oh, child, we had no idea. We've been so cruel, so wrong about you." A sad, tired smile touched Sarah's lips. It didn't reach her eyes. "No, ma'am. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see. A quiet girl who wouldn't cause any trouble. Someone invisible." Mr. Henderson, the portly store owner, pushed through the growing crowd, his face flushed. "Sarah May! You saved us! You saved the whole town!" But as the town gathered around her, their voices a babble of praise and amazement, Sarah felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. She hadn't saved them. She had only delayed the inevitable. She hadn't been invisible enough. She looked at Sheriff Wyatt, and for the first time she noticed something in his eyes. It wasn't just gratitude. It was calculation. And that's when she knew. Her carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The ghosts of Cedar Ridge weren't just in her memory anymore. They were right here, in Millbrook. And they were coming for her. The whispers in Millbrook changed overnight. They were no longer about the simple-minded store girl. Now they were about the angel of Cedar Ridge, the phantom law woman who had faced down Jake Morrison without blinking. The story grew, as stories do, embellished with each telling, until Sarah May Thompson was less a person and more a legend of the West, born right there on their dusty Main Street. Children would stop and stare at her with wide, reverent eyes. Mrs. Abernathy now brought her freshly baked pies every morning. Mr. Henderson insisted on paying her double, his gratitude mixed with a palpable nervousness, as if he were afraid she might vanish as quickly as she had appeared. Sarah tried to slip back into her old routine, into her comfortable cloak of silence and invisibility. But it was no use. The cloak had been torn away. Everyone saw her now, and she hated it. Every glance felt like an accusation. Every whispered word of praise felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of her quiet life. Sheriff Wyatt became a frequent visitor to the general store. He'd lean against the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, and talk to her for hours. He spoke of the burdens of the badge, the loneliness of the law, the constant threat that lurked just over the horizon. He spoke to her as an equal, a comrade in arms, and every word made her skin crawl. "You know," he said one evening, as she was sweeping up for the night, the golden lamplight casting long shadows across the floor, "I could use a deputy, a real one, someone with experience." Sarah stopped sweeping. She looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the kind, weathered face that the town trusted implicitly. "I told you, Sheriff," she said, her voice flat. I'm done with that life. Are you? He asked gently, his eyes filled with a sincerity that almost felt real. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like that life isn't done with you. You have a gift, Sarah. A duty. You can't just hide it under a bushel. She wanted to scream at him. This isn't a gift. It's a curse. It's a stain I can't wash out. But she just shook her head and went back to her sweeping. I'll think about it, she mumbled, just to make him leave. He smiled, a warm, fatherly smile. That's all I can ask. He tipped his hat and walked out into the cool desert night. Sarah watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Wyatt wasn't just a simple town sheriff. His questions were too pointed, his knowledge of her supposed past too convenient. He wasn't just offering her a job. He was trying to put a leash on her. Later that night, unable to sleep, she sat by the small window in her back room, staring out at the star-dusted sky. The quiet she had craved now felt suffocating. The peace she had built felt like a prison wall. Her mind kept replaying the confrontation with Morrison, his initial shock, his fear, and then something else, something she had missed in the heat of the moment. You think I'm scared of you? He had sneered. I know what really happened at Cedar Ridge, and so does the sheriff. At the time, she dismissed it as a desperate bluff. But now, the words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. How could Morrison know anything about Cedar Ridge? The official story was sealed in federal files. A heroic deputy marshal single-handedly stopping the Dalton gang's last ride. 17 innocent lives saved, 4 outlaws dead, 2 captured. A clean story, a heroic story, a complete and utter lie. A week later, a traveling preacher brought news from the next county. Jake Morrison was dead, found shot in the back in an arroyo 50 miles from Millbrook. The official story was that bounty hunters had caught up to him. Justice served. Case closed. Sarah felt no relief, only a deeper, colder fear. Dead men tell no tales. Who had silenced him, and why? That afternoon, she made a decision. She couldn't live in this fog of uncertainty any longer. She needed answers. She walked into the sheriff's office, not with a cup of coffee, but with a cold resolve in her eyes. Wyatt looked up from his paperwork, a welcoming smile on his face. Sarah May, come to take me up on my offer? I have some questions, she said, her voice steady. She stood in front of his desk, refusing his offer of a seat. About Jake Morrison. The sheriff's smile didn't falter, but his eyes became guarded. What about him? The man's dead. Good riddance. He said something to me, Sarah pressed on. During the standoff, he said he knew what really happened at Cedar Ridge. She watched his face, searching for any flicker of a reaction. Wyatt chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. Desperate men say desperate things, Sarah. He was trying to get under your skin, trying to rattle the great Marshal Thompson. He also said you knew, she added quietly. The air in the small office suddenly felt thick, heavy. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, the friendly facade finally cracking, replaced by something hard and unyielding. What are you getting at, girl? He asked, his voice losing its gentle edge. How did you know about me, Sheriff? She asked. No one knew I was here. I made sure of that. I vanished. But you found me. You walked into the general store 2 years ago and offered Mr. Henderson $100 in gold coin to give me a room and a job. No questions asked. You told him I was your niece, running from a bad marriage. The color drained from Wyatt's face. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. How did you know that? Mr. Henderson is a good man, Sarah said, but he's a terrible liar, and he's been terrified of you since the day I arrived. Wyatt slowly stood up, his hand resting on the desk, inches from his gun. The kindness was completely gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, predatory light. He wasn't the town's protector. He was its warden. "You should have left it alone, Sarah," he said, his voice a low growl. "You should have been content with the peace I gave you." "This isn't peace," she shot back, her own hand instinctively moving closer to the small pistol she had kept hidden in the waistband of her dress for 2 years. "This is a cage. You didn't rescue me. You brought me here for a reason. What is it? What's in Millbrook that's so important you needed a watchdog?" Wyatt's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "It's not what's in Millbrook, Sarah. It's who." Before she could react, the back door of the sheriff's office swung open. A man stepped out of the shadows of the holding cells. He was tall, dressed in a fine city suit that was grotesquely out of place in the dusty Arizona town. He had a neatly trimmed mustache and cold, intelligent eyes that seemed to dissect her on the spot. Sarah knew him. Her blood ran cold. It was Deputy Marshal Jennings, the man who had written the report on Cedar Ridge, the man who had declared her a hero, the man she had last seen in a Denver hospital, telling her she was lucky to be alive. "Hello, Sarah," Jennings said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "It's been a long time. I see the memory is starting to come back. We were hoping it wouldn't." Sarah's world tilted. The room seemed to shrink around her. Jennings, here, with Wyatt. What is this?" she stammered, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. "This," Jennings said, taking a step forward, "is a loose end. Jake Morrison was a loose end. A drunken fool who couldn't keep his mouth shut about things that don't concern him. His brother was part of the Dalton crew, a low-level mule. When we took the gang down at Cedar Ridge, he got away. He knew things. So we sent Wyatt to clean it up." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture so monstrous she could barely comprehend it. "The bank robbery," she whispered. "Wyatt didn't kill Danny Morrison in a fair fight." "There was no bank robbery," Wyatt said with a shrug. "The boy came to town asking questions. I took him out into the desert and put a bullet in his head. Simple as that." The casual brutality of his confession struck her like a physical blow. This man, this kind, fatherly sheriff, was a cold-blooded killer. "And Morrison came for revenge," Sarah said, her mind racing. "But that's not what he was really after, was it?" Jennings smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "No. The fool thought his brother had hidden something before Wyatt got to him. A map, leading to the real prize from the Cedar Ridge job." "The massacre," Sarah breathed, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "It wasn't a massacre, Sarah. It was a business transaction," Jennings corrected her. "The Daltons had stolen $500,000 in untraceable government gold. We, a few enterprising marshals, made a deal. We'd give them safe passage in exchange for a cut, but our benefactor decided he wanted it all. So we set a trap. We wiped out the Daltons and took the gold for ourselves." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Almost all of us. There was one other person who knew where the gold was hidden, the gang's accountant, a timid little bookkeeper who got scared and ran with the map. We've been looking for him for 2 years." Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the final terrible piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The timid bookkeeper, the man who had vanished, Mr. Henderson. "The general store," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jennings's smile widened. Bingo. Morrison, in his quest for revenge, stumbled onto the truth. He figured out Henderson was here. He came to get the map. We couldn't let that happen. We needed him to create a scene, to draw you out, to confirm our suspicions that you were still capable. It was all a setup, a grand, elaborate play, and she had been the star performer. They had used Morrison's rage to test her, to see if the legendary killer they had lost track of was still inside the quiet store girl. "And me?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt like it could split the earth. What was my part in your business transaction? You, Sarah? Jennings said with a sigh, as if explaining something to a difficult child. You were never supposed to be a hero. You were supposed to be a corpse. You were the lookout for the Daltons. Your job was to watch the road and warn them. But you got greedy. You wanted a bigger cut. You tried to play both sides. The accusation was so absurd, so fundamentally wrong, it stole her breath. Lookout? Greedy? It made no sense. That's a lie, she choked out. Is it? Jennings countered smoothly. You were found at the scene, the only one left alive, a bullet in your head and no memory of what happened. It was perfect. We built a legend around you, the lone, heroic marshal who survived. It was the perfect cover story. It explained the dead bodies and hid the missing gold. We even gave you a medal. He took another step closer. But then you ran, disappeared. We couldn't have that. A loose cannon with a fractured memory who might one day remember the truth. So I assigned one of my most trusted men to find you, to watch you, to keep you quiet and contained. He gestured to the sheriff. Sheriff Thomas Wyatt isn't his real name, of course, Jennings said dismissively. He's a disgraced lawman who knows which side his bread is buttered on. He built this entire town, this peaceful little prison, just for you, Sarah. The foundation of her world had crumbled to dust. Her past was a lie. Her present was a cage. The man she thought was her friend was her jailer. The man who had declared her a hero was the architect of her damnation. So what now? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Now, Jennings said, pulling a small, silver-plated derringer from his coat pocket. We finally finished the job we should have finished 2 years ago. Wyatt, secure the store, get the map from Henderson, and make sure he doesn't say a word to anyone, ever. Wyatt nodded, drawing his own pistol, his eyes fixed on Sarah. It's a shame, Sarah. I was starting to like you. And I, Jennings added, leveling the derringer at her heart, will deal with our little fallen angel. Don't worry. This time, I won't miss. The world narrowed to the small, dark hole at the end of Jennings's pistol. This was it, the end of the line, trapped, outgunned, her entire life revealed as a monstrous fraud. But as Jennings's finger tightened on the trigger, something inside Sarah snapped. It wasn't the heroic marshal from the legends. It wasn't the broken, silent girl from the general store. It was something primal, something that refused to die. She wasn't an angel. She was a survivor. And the time for silence was over. The gunshot, when it came, wasn't from Jennings's derringer. It was from the street. A deafening roar that shattered the window of the sheriff's office, spraying glass and splinters across the room. Jennings cried out in surprise and pain, stumbling back as a red flower blossomed on his shoulder. Wyatt spun around, his pistol swinging toward the door, his face a mask of fury. What in the hell? Sarah didn't wait to ask questions. In that split second of chaos, she moved. She dove to the side, rolling behind Wyatt's heavy oak desk, as another shot ripped through the doorframe where she had just been standing. Wood exploded inwards. "It's Henderson!" Wyatt roared, crouching down. "The old fool has a shotgun!" "Mr. Henderson? The timid, portly shopkeeper?" Sarah's mind struggled to keep up. The man who was supposed to be a cowering bookkeeper was now laying down covering fire like a seasoned soldier. "Stay here! I'll handle him!" Wyatt yelled at Jennings, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face pale and twisted with rage. Wyatt darted out the front door of his office, firing his pistol blindly into the street. Sarah could hear the thunderous boom of a shotgun in reply, followed by the sound of Wyatt cursing. She was alone in the room with a wounded and furious Jennings. "You!" Jennings snarled, his eyes locking on her hiding place behind the desk. He raised his derringer, his hand shaking from the pain in his shoulder. "You planned this. You were working with him all along." Sarah didn't answer. She was frantically searching the drawers of Wyatt's desk. Papers, wanted posters, spare ammunition. and then her fingers closed around something hard and metallic. A second revolver, Wyatt's backup piece, fully loaded. She pulled it out just as Jennings fired. The bullet slammed into the thick oak of the desk, inches from her head. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. She didn't hesitate. She rose up from behind the desk, the heavy Colt feeling steady and familiar in her hand, and fired. Jennings was a desk marshal, a politician with a badge. He was a plotter, not a fighter. His eyes widened in shock as her bullet tore through his gun hand, sending his derringer clattering to the floor. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed against the wall, cradling his shattered hand. It was over in a second, but the battle outside was just beginning. Sarah scrambled to the shattered window, peering out into the chaotic street. It wasn't just Henderson. The entire town of Millbrook had erupted. Mr. Henderson was crouched behind an overturned wagon, his shotgun smoking. But he wasn't alone. The blacksmith was there, armed with a buffalo rifle. 2 ranchers who had been in town for supplies were firing pistols from the doorway of the saloon. And Mrs. Abernathy, the gossiping woman who baked pies, was standing on the boardwalk of the general store, calmly reloading Henderson's spare revolver as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Wyatt was pinned down behind the water trough, desperately firing back, but he was hopelessly outgunned. The town he had built as a prison had turned on him. What was going on? Why were they fighting for her? They thought she was a quiet store clerk just moments ago. Then she saw it. Lying in the dust near the sheriff's office was a small, leather-bound journal, the one she kept in her room, filled with her fractured thoughts, her nightmares about Cedar Ridge, her suspicions about Wyatt. Henderson must have found it. He must have shown them. They weren't fighting for the legendary Marshall Thompson. They were fighting for Sarah May. Their Sarah May, the quiet girl who they had misjudged, who had been living in a cage right under their noses. A fierce, protective warmth flooded her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the cold duty of a lawman. It was belonging. "It's over, Wyatt," Henderson's voice boomed, deeper and more confident than she had ever heard it. "You and your pack of wolves aren't welcome here anymore." Wyatt, seeing his position was hopeless, made a desperate move. He bolted from behind the trough, sprinting for the stables at the end of the street, hoping to get to a horse and escape. He never made it. A single shot rang out, sharp and clear, from an unexpected direction. From the second-story window of the hotel. Wyatt stumbled, cried out, and fell face first into the dust, a dark stain spreading across his back. Sarah's eyes shot up to the hotel window. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the light, holding a smoking rifle. The figure was tall and lean. It wasn't a townsperson. As the figure stepped forward into the light, Sarah's heart stopped. It was Jake Morrison. He wasn't dead. He wasn't a ghost. He was standing right there, very much alive. The story about the bounty hunters had been a lie, another layer of deception in this tangled web. Morrison lowered his rifle and looked down at the street, his eyes finding Sarah's across the distance. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. A nod of respect, a nod of alliance. The pieces of the puzzle exploded in her mind, rearranging themselves into a new, even more shocking picture. Morrison hadn't come to Millbrook for revenge, not just for revenge. His brother hadn't just been a low-level mule. He'd been trying to get a message out, a warning. Morrison had been hunting the same people she was. He hadn't been her enemy. He had been trying to find an ally. He hadn't been testing her that day in the square. He had been trying to wake her up. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. Wyatt was dead. Jennings was wounded and disarmed. The people of Millbrook, armed and resolute, stood victorious in their street. Sarah walked out of the sheriff's office, the heavy Colt still in her hand, and into the sunlight. She looked at Henderson, at Mrs. Abernathy, at the faces of the people who had judged her and now had fought for her. "We read your journal, child," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice thick with emotion. Henderson found it. We realized what he was, what he'd done to you. He wasn't my keeper, Henderson said, his voice grim. He was my jailer, too. I'm not just a bookkeeper, Sarah. My name is Henry Wallace. I was the lead investigator for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, assigned to the Dalton case. I got too close to the conspiracy, to Jennings and his crew. They tried to kill me, framed me, and forced me into hiding. That map thereafter? It doesn't lead to gold. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn oilskin packet. It's my case file. Names, dates, bank transfers. Everything needed to bring down Jennings' entire network, which reaches all the way to the War Department in Washington. Sarah stared at him, dumbfounded. The timid shopkeeper was a legendary Pinkerton detective. The gossiping old woman was his partner in hiding. The entire town, it seemed, was more than it appeared. "And Morrison?" she asked, her voice a whisper. As if on cue, Jake Morrison walked down the hotel stairs and into the street. He wasn't swaggering now. He looked tired, but resolute. "My brother Danny wasn't a criminal," Morrison said, his voice raw with a grief that was years old. He was an undercover Army Ranger, working with Wallace to expose Jennings. When they were found out, Wallace faked his death and went into hiding. They killed my brother and branded him a traitor and an outlaw. He stopped in front of Sarah. "I've been hunting them for 2 years. I knew they were using you, keeping you as a sleeping weapon. I heard the legend they built around you, but I also heard whispers of the real you, the woman you were before they broke you. I had to see for myself. I had to know if you were still in there." The confrontation in the square hadn't been a threat. It had been a desperate gamble to get her attention, to break through the fog of her prison. He looked over at the wounded Jennings, who was being tied up by the blacksmith. "He's the one who gave the order to kill my brother, but he's just a lieutenant. The man at the top, the man we really want, is General Alistair Crane." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. General Crane. The man who had personally awarded her the medal for her heroism at Cedar Ridge. The man who had looked her in the eye and called her the pride of the service. The benefactor Jennings had mentioned. It wasn't just a few corrupt marshals. It was a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the nation. "So what really happened at Cedar Ridge?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for 2 years. "Who was I?" Wallace, the man she knew as Henderson, stepped forward, his expression full of a sad sympathy. "You weren't a lookout, Sarah. You weren't a traitor. You weren't even a U.S. Marshal," he said gently. "You were my partner." The revelation was a quiet thunderclap that silenced the street. "You were Sarah May O'Malley," Wallace continued, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "The best undercover operative I ever worked with. You had infiltrated the Dalton gang deeper than anyone thought possible. You were the one who fed me the information about Jennings and his conspiracy. We were going to meet at Cedar Ridge, you, me, and Morrison's brother, to put all the pieces together and expose them." He looked away, his eyes pained. "But they found out. They set the trap for all of us. It was a kill zone. They got Danny. They got me, or so they thought, and they put a bullet in your head. The trauma of the wound, the shock, it shattered your memory. It broke you into pieces." Jennings, seeing a chance to save himself, had improvised. He couldn't let it be known that a top Pinkerton agent and 2 government operatives were at the scene, so he invented a new identity for her. He took the broken pieces of Sarah May O'Malley and cobbled them together into the legend of Marshal Sarah Thompson. It was the perfect way to hide her in plain sight, to discredit her if she ever started to remember. She wasn't a fallen angel. She was a silenced agent. She looked down at her hands, the hands of a store clerk, the hands of a gunslinger, the hands of an investigator. All the fractured parts of herself suddenly clicked into place. She wasn't broken. She had just been disassembled. "So the quiet life," she whispered, "the need for peace, It was never real. It was the cage they built for your mind, Morrison said grimly. But they made one mistake. They underestimated you. They thought they could break you. They only made you stronger. Sarah looked around at the faces of Millbrook, the blacksmith, the ranchers, Mrs. Abernathy, who was now holding the shotgun with a determined look on her face. She looked at Wallace, her lost partner. She looked at Morrison, her unlikely ally. They weren't just townsfolk. They were a small, defiant army. And Millbrook wasn't a prison. It was a fortress. A new clarity settled over her, sharp and cold and powerful. Her name was Sarah May O'Malley, and she had a war to finish. "All right, Henry," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that was all her own, the voice of a commander taking charge of her troops. "Give me the file. Let's go hunting." The transformation of Millbrook was immediate and absolute. The sleepy, dusty town became a military command post overnight. Wallace, or Henry as she now knew him, unpacked equipment he had kept hidden for 2 years. Telegraph keys, cipher charts, maps, and dossiers on every member of General Crane's network. The general store was no longer a store, it was a war room. Mrs. Abernathy, whose real name was Martha, turned out to be Henry's wife and a former telegraph operator for the Army. She immediately set to work, tapping out coded messages to the few loyal contacts Henry still had within the government. Jake Morrison, no longer playing the part of a vengeful outlaw, became their tactical chief. He organized the townsfolk into a surprisingly effective militia, setting up watch posts on the mesas and patrol routes through the surrounding canyons. These were hard people, accustomed to the harsh realities of the frontier. They took to their new roles with a grim determination. They were protecting one of their own. And Sarah was reborn. The fractured pieces of her memory began to knit themselves back together. Flashes of her past life returned to her, stakeouts in smoky saloons, chases through moonlit forests, the quiet click of a lockpick in the dead of night. She remembered her training, her skills, the woman she used to be, the confidence, the sharp analytical mind, the instinct for a predator's weakness. She and Henry would stay up late into the night, poring over the file, connecting the dots, mapping out Crane's vast criminal enterprise. It was more than just gold. Crane was selling military secrets, arming dissident factions, and positioning himself to seize power in the turbulent aftermath of the war. He was a traitor of the highest order. "He's insulated himself perfectly," Henry said one night, his finger tracing a complex web of names on a map. "Every layer is protected by another. To get to Crane, we have to dismantle his entire operation, piece by piece." "Then that's what we'll do," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with cold fire. "We'll start with the closest piece, the one he'll send to clean up this mess." She was right. Crane couldn't afford to let the situation in Millbrook fester. He couldn't risk word getting out. He would send his best cleaner, his most ruthless enforcer. A week later, a lone rider was spotted approaching from the east. He wasn't trying to be stealthy. He rode a magnificent white horse and wore the uniform of a U.S. Marshal, the silver star on his chest glinting in the sun. "It's him," Morrison said, watching from the ridge through a spyglass. "Captain Marcus Thorne, Crane's right-hand man. They call him the Judge." Sarah knew the name. Thorne was a legend in the Marshal Service, known for his relentless pursuit of fugitives and his absolute, unbending interpretation of the law. He was also, according to Henry's file, Crane's personal assassin. "He'll expect a fight," Sarah said. "He'll expect a town full of scared citizens and a few rogue agents. He won't be expecting a fortress." "What's the plan?" Jake asked. "We don't fight him," Sarah replied, a slow, cunning smile spreading across her face. "We welcome him." When Captain Thorne rode into Millbrook, he found a scene of perfect, unnerving tranquility. The street was clean. The townsfolk were going about their business, nodding to him politely. There were no barricades, no visible weapons. It looked like any other peaceful frontier town. It put him on edge immediately. This wasn't what he expected. Sarah was waiting for him on the porch of the general store, sitting in a rocking chair, sipping a glass of lemonade. She wore a clean blue dress. The Winchester was nowhere in sight. She looked up as he dismounted, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Afternoon, Marshal," she said calmly. "You look thirsty. Long ride." Thorne, a man with ice water for blood and a face carved from granite, stared at her. He recognized her from the file. Sarah May O'Malley, the ghost. "I'm here on official business," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I have a warrant for the arrest of a fugitive known as Henry Wallace, and I'm here to take a federal prisoner, Deputy Marshal Jennings, into custody." "Jennings?" Sarah said with a thoughtful frown. "Oh, you mean the fellow we have locked up in the ice house? He had a bit of an accident. Tripped and fell. Repeatedly." She took a slow sip of her lemonade. "As for Henry Wallace, I'm afraid you've been misinformed. There's no one by that name here." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "I will not be obstructed, madam. I have the authority of the United States government." "Do you?" Sarah asked sweetly. "Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man who's a long way from home, all by yourself. And Millbrook, well, we're a very tight-knit community. We look after our own." On cue, every door on Main Street opened. The blacksmith stood in his doorway, polishing a hammer. The ranchers lounged on the saloon porch, casually cleaning their fingernails with hunting knives. Mrs. Abernathy, or Martha, stood on her own porch, shaking out a rug with vigorous, threatening snaps. No one held a gun. No one made a threat. But the message was unmistakable. You are surrounded. Thorne's hand, which had been resting on his gun, slowly moved away. He was a killer, but he wasn't a fool. He was in a trap. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tight. "I want you to take a message back to your master," Sarah said, her voice losing its sweetness and hardening into steel. "Tell General Crane that his game is over. Tell him Sarah May O'Malley remembers everything. And tell him I'm coming for him." She stood up from the rocking chair and walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at the legendary marshal. "But that's not all," she said. "I'm offering him a deal. One chance. He dissolves his network, turns himself in, and faces justice. If he does that, I'll see to it that the full extent of his treason remains a government secret to prevent a national panic. If he refuses..." She let the threat hang in the air. "You are in no position to make demands," Thorne snarled. "Oh, I think I am," Sarah replied. She nodded to Jake, who was watching from the hotel balcony. Jake raised a hand, and from the rooftops and alleyways, a dozen rifles appeared, all centered on Thorne's chest. Thorne's face went rigid. He had walked into a perfectly executed ambush without a single shot being fired. "Tell him he has 48 hours to respond," Sarah said. "You can leave your horse. You'll make better time on foot. It gives a man more time to think." She turned and walked back into the general store, leaving Thorne standing alone in the street, humiliated and disarmed, surrounded by the silent, watchful eyes of the people of Millbrook. The great Captain Thorne, the judge, had been judged and found wanting. The first move in their war had been made, not with bullets, but with a quiet, terrifying promise. The game was on. The 48 hours passed in a state of tense, coiled silence. Millbrook had become an armed camp, every citizen a soldier, every window a potential sniper's nest. They waited for General Crane's response. They knew it wouldn't be a surrender. It came just after dawn on the third day, not as a direct assault, but as something far more insidious. A rider approached under a flag of truce, carrying a message. It wasn't for Sarah. It was for Jake Morrison. The message was from Crane himself. It contained a full pardon for all of Jake's past crimes, a substantial sum of money, and the confirmed location of the last two men from Thorne's squad who had participated in his brother's murder. All Jake had to do was walk away. Let Crane handle Sarah and the others, and he could have his vengeance and his freedom. It was a brilliant move, designed to fracture their alliance, to turn them against each other. Jake brought the letter straight to Sarah and Henry in the war room. He laid it on the table, his face unreadable. "He's trying to buy me," Jake said, his voice a low growl. "It's what he does," Henry said grimly. "He finds a man's weakness, and he exploits it." Sarah watched Jake, her gaze steady. She didn't say a word. She just waited. This was his test, his moment of choice. Everything depended on it. Jake stared at the letter, at the promise of everything he had fought for over the last 2 years. Vengeance for his brother. A clean slate. A new life. Then slowly, deliberately, he picked up the letter, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the cold stove. "My brother didn't die so I could cut a deal with his murderer," he said, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "We finish this. Together." A wave of relief washed over Sarah, so profound it almost buckled her knees. Their alliance was forged in something stronger than vengeance. It was forged in justice. "Good," she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "Because I have a plan. Crane thinks he can break us apart. We're going to use that against him. We're going to tear his organization apart from the inside out." Her plan was audacious. It was dangerous. It was borderline suicidal. She proposed that Jake Morrison accept Crane's offer. "He what?" Henry exclaimed, looking at her as if she'd lost her mind. "He accepts," Sarah repeated calmly. "He rides out of here, pretending he's taken the deal. Crane will be expecting him. He'll want to meet with him, to use him. That's our way in. Jake becomes our Trojan horse." Jake's eyes lit up with a dangerous gleam. He understood immediately. "I get close to Crane. I find out where he's holed up, what his endgame is. I become his most trusted new ally." "It's too risky," Henry argued. "They'll be watching him. One slip up and he's dead." "I've been playing a role for 2 years, Henry," Jake countered. "I think I can handle this one." Sarah knew the risks, but she also knew it was their only chance. A direct assault on Crane's unknown fortress would be a massacre. They had to be smarter. They had to be more ruthless. So they staged a loud, furious argument in the middle of Main Street for the benefit of any spies Crane might have watching the town. Jake accused Sarah of using him, of caring more about her war than his justice. Sarah accused him of being a selfish, honorless outlaw. It was a masterful performance. Jake Morrison rode out of Millbrook that afternoon, his face a mask of thunderous rage. He didn't look back. To any observer, the Millbrook alliance was broken, and General Crane's trap had been sprung. Weeks turned into a nerve-wracking month. There was no word from Jake. Every day, the silence stretched tauter. Henry and the others grew more anxious, convinced Jake had been discovered and killed. Only Sarah kept the faith. She knew Jake. She trusted him. She spent the time preparing. Using Henry's files, she and Martha sent out a new wave of coded telegraphs, not to government officials, but to the newspapers. They leaked small, unattributed stories, a suspicious arms shipment here, a sudden resignation of a decorated officer there. They started planting seeds of doubt, creating whispers of corruption that would slowly eat away at Crane's power base. Then, one night, the telegraph key in the back of the general store began to click. It was a code Sarah and Jake had devised, one known only to them. It was a single word: Blackwood. Henry checked his maps. Blackwood was a decommissioned military fort deep in the remote mountains of Colorado, a place officially erased from all records. Crane's fortress. The message continued. Crane was moving up his timetable. He was gathering his loyalists for a final summit. He was planning a coup. And the centerpiece of his plan was the assassination of President Grant during his upcoming tour of the West. They had less than a week. "He's got a small army in there," Henry said, his face pale. "We can't take him with what we have." "We won't have to," Sarah said, a fierce light in her eyes. "We're not going to lay siege to the fort. We're going to make the fort come to us." She began to issue a rapid-fire series of orders. The people of Millbrook, her loyal army, moved with quiet efficiency. They were no longer just defending their town. They were preparing to save the nation. Her plan was to lure Crane out, and she knew exactly what bait to use, the biggest prize of all, the $500,000 in stolen government gold from Cedar Ridge. Henry looked at her, stunned. But we don't have the gold. It was never recovered. I know, Sarah said with a cunning grin. But Crane doesn't know that. As far as he knows, you were the only one who knew where it was hidden. And you've been here, in Millbrook, for 2 years. Their new telegraphs were targeted. They sent messages to known associates of Crane, men whose loyalty was questionable, men motivated by greed. The message was simple. Henry Wallace was moving the Cedar Ridge gold. He was taking it from its hiding place near Millbrook and transporting it east by wagon train. It was a lie, a ghost story. But it was a lie Crane couldn't afford to ignore. That gold was the foundation of his entire operation. He couldn't let it slip through his fingers. He would be forced to abandon the security of his fortress and come after it. They prepared a single, heavily guarded wagon. They filled it with sacks of sand, and then, with Henry driving and Sarah riding shotgun, dressed as a simple farm wife, they set out onto the open plains, directly into the jaws of the trap. The rest of the Millbrook militia, led by Martha, melted into the surrounding hills and canyons, a hidden army waiting for the signal. They were a single, vulnerable wagon in the vast, empty desert. They were the bait, and they knew the sharks were circling. For 2 days, they traveled in silence, the tension a living thing between them. The sky was a vast, empty blue canvas. The silence of the plains was absolute. Then, on the 3rd morning, they appeared. A dust cloud on the horizon, growing rapidly. It wasn't a small raiding party. It was an army. At least 50 riders, moving fast, led by a man on a white horse, Captain Thorne. But at his side, riding with him, was another man, Jake Morrison. Sarah's heart pounded. This was the moment of truth. Had Jake succeeded, or had he been turned? Thorne's army fanned out, surrounding the lone wagon in a wide, menacing circle. Thorne and Jake rode forward alone. Thorne's face was a mask of triumphant arrogance. "It's over, O'Malley. Did you really think we would fall for such an obvious trick?" He gestured to Jake. "Your Trojan horse led us right to you. He has been very cooperative." Jake wouldn't meet her eyes. His face was grim, set in hard lines. Sarah's blood ran cold. Had she been wrong? Had she trusted the wrong man? "The gold, Wallace," Thorne demanded. "Hand it over now and I may be persuaded to make your deaths quick." Henry looked at Sarah, his face pale with fear. Their gamble had failed. They were trapped, outnumbered, betrayed. But Sarah wasn't looking at Thorne. She was looking at Jake, and she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible signal. He briefly touched the brim of his hat. It was the sign. The plan was still in motion. He was still with them. He was just playing his part to the bitter end. Sarah took a deep breath. It was time to spring the final trap. "You're right, Captain," she said, her voice ringing with false defeat. "You've won. The gold is yours." She turned to Henry. "Open the back of the wagon." Henry, looking utterly confused, did as he was told. He unlatched the back of the wagon, revealing the sacks of sand. Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure fury. "Sand? You led us out here for a wagon full of sand? I'll kill you for this." "The gold was never here, Marcus," a new voice said, a voice that dripped with authority and cold amusement. A new figure rode out from behind Thorne's line of men. He was an older man, distinguished, with a perfectly trimmed gray beard and the cold, dead eyes of a snake. He wore the uniform of a general of the United States Army, General Alistair Crane. He had come himself. The bait had been too tempting to resist. "The gold is exactly where it has been for the last 2 years, Crane said, his eyes locking on Sarah. Buried under the floorboards of the general store in your pathetic little town, we received a tip from a very reliable source." He smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression. "My men are digging it up as we speak. I have my fortune, and I have the traitors who would stand against me. All that's left is the cleanup." He gestured to Thorn. "Kill them." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. A trick. He had outsmarted them. He had sent Thorn and a token force as a diversion, while his main force sacked the undefended town. Martha, the ranchers, the blacksmith, they were all walking into a slaughter. But then Jake Morrison finally looked at her, and he smiled. "You're wrong, General," Jake said, his voice loud and clear. He turned his horse, positioning himself between Crane and Sarah. "You see, I never told you where the gold was. I only told you where Henry told me it was." Crane's eyes widened in confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Sarah said, a triumphant grin spreading across her face, "is that you just sent your entire army into a trap." She raised her hand high in the air and fired her pistol once toward the sky. And the world exploded. From the canyons and hillsides, the Millbrook militia opened fire. It was a devastating, perfectly coordinated ambush. Thorne's men, caught completely in the open, were cut down in a hail of lead. They panicked, their lines breaking, their discipline shattering under the unexpected onslaught. But that wasn't the main event. 5 miles away, in Millbrook, Crane's elite soldiers were tearing up the floor of the general store. They found nothing. As their commander realized he'd been tricked, the doors to the store were barricaded from the outside. The windows were shuttered. And from the buildings all around, the remaining townsfolk, led by Martha, opened fire. Crane's men were trapped inside the store, caught in a kill box of their own making. Back on the plains, the battle was short and brutal. Thorne, trying to rally his terrified men, was cut down by a long-distance shot from Henry's buffalo rifle. Crane, his face a mask of disbelief and apoplectic rage, found himself abandoned, his army disintegrating around him. He stared at Sarah, at Jake, at the single wagon that had brought about his ruin. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling with hate, "you will not win." He drew his ornate pearl-handled revolver and spurred his horse directly at Sarah, a mad, suicidal charge. Jake moved to intercept him, but Sarah waved him off. "He's mine." She stood her ground, calm and unmoving, as the general of the United States Army bore down on her. She let him get close, so close she could see the madness in his eyes. At the last possible second, she didn't fire her gun. She dropped it, and she drew the simple hunting knife she had kept strapped to her boot. As Crane's horse thundered past, she sidestepped like a matador and lunged, not at the man, but at the saddle's girth. The knife flashed. The leather strap snapped. Crane, caught completely off guard, was thrown from his horse, his shot going wild as he tumbled ignominiously into the dust at her feet. He lay there, stunned and disarmed, looking up at the woman he had tried to break, the ghost he had tried to bury. Sarah picked up his fallen revolver and pointed it at his head. "It's over, Alistair," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of finality. The war was won. In the aftermath, the full scope of their victory became clear. Crane's network, decapitated and in disarray, was swiftly rounded up by the loyal government forces Henry had finally been able to contact. President Grant's tour was rerouted, the assassination plot foiled. The nation was safe, though it would never know how close it had come to disaster. Henry Wallace was reinstated to the Pinkerton Agency with honors, a national hero. Jake Morrison received a full presidential pardon and was offered a commission in the Army Rangers, following in his brother's footsteps. And Sarah Mae O'Malley was offered anything she wanted, a position at the highest levels of government intelligence, a command of her own, the gratitude of a nation. She turned it all down. She returned to Millbrook. The town was battered but whole, its people bound together by the fire they had walked through. They rebuilt the general store. They buried their dead. And they went back to their lives, forever changed. Sarah stood on the porch of the new Henderson's General Store, now officially Wallace and Abernathy Outfitters, and looked out at the peaceful street. She was no longer Sarah Mae Thompson, the silent girl. She was no longer Sarah Mae O'Malley, the phantom agent. She was just Sarah, the woman who had found her home not by running from the world, but by fighting for it. Her silence was no longer a shield of fear. It was a comfortable quiet, the quiet of a person at peace with who she was. Sheriff Wyatt's office had a new occupant, Jake Morrison. He had accepted the pardon but respectfully declined the Army commission. He said he'd found his place. The badge on his chest didn't represent the law of a distant government. It represented the will of the people of Millbrook. He walked over and stood beside her on the porch, a comfortable silence between them. "You know," he said finally, "that deputy position is still open." Sarah looked at him and, for the first time in a very, very long time, she smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and lit them up from within. "I'll think about it," she said. The legend of the silent girl of Millbrook would be told for generations, a story of courage and secrets in the heart of the Old West. But the town of Millbrook knew the truth. They knew that sometimes the quietest people have the most to say, and the deepest waters hide a strength that can change the world. They had seen it with their own eyes, and they would never forget it. If you enjoyed this story of hidden heroes and hard-won justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. And let me know in the comments, what do you think Sarah's next adventure should be? We'll see you in the next story.